Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The UK has 2 weeks to make it clear what it will pay for to leave the EU, or talks on a trade deal won't start next month. That is the ultimatum from the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier. He says it's vital that the UK make concessions and increase its offer. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, says good progress has been made in talks so far, though how to resolve the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland remains a sticking point. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, has been following today's talks in Brussels.
Time is a precious commodity, and don't the UK and the EU know it? We're halfway now between the date of our EU referendum and actually leaving the club. Expect many more face-offs along the way. By now, round 6 of Brexit negotiations, all attempts at bilateral banter have gone.
This is a serious business,
said David Davis. It is. The EU is the UK's biggest trading partner. Security and research and development ties are tight. All this now hangs in the balance as we untangle ourselves from Brussels, the government still hoping, though, to keep European relations close.
We will discuss this issue bilaterally.
Relations right now are strained. The UK wants to talk about trade and the future. The EU response, make more headway, real and sincere progress, as Michel Barnier put it, on key Brexit divorce issues by the end of this month, or forget talk of trade till at least February next year. So where are we on the Brexit divorce issues, and what does real and sincere progress mean? Citizens' rights aren't yet resolved, but progress has been made. Ireland's border remains a big problem. The EU thinks it can be resolved next year, though the UK today rejected an EU proposal to keep Northern Ireland in the single market and customs union. The massive sticking point right now is money. The EU wants cast iron, possibly written guarantees the UK will honour financial agreements made while an EU member. A lot to ask for in 2 weeks. The EU is really trying to pile on the pressure. It wants that money. Otherwise, Brussels threatens to dash the Prime Minister's hopes in this room in December at a summit of EU leaders. What Theresa May wants is the green light from her EU counterparts to go ahead with what's known as Stage 2 of the Brexit negotiations. That's talk of trade and of transition deals. On both sides of the Channel, companies ache for news. Uncertainty is very bad for business. But trade experts say EU-UK fallout over Brexit divorce issues will seem child's play compared to complications when it comes to trade.
The real obstacle is to come, which is when Britain tries to negotiate a new trade deal with the EU. And it's looking for something that's as good as or better than what it has now, which will be extremely difficult to achieve, because why would 27 countries, each of which have a veto, agree unanimously to give Britain something that's better than what they have?
Can Britain get a new trade deal with the EU by the time it leaves, so by March 2019?
Not in my view.
No one can stop time, of course, but when it comes to Brexit, time can be stretched, negotiations extended, if everyone agrees. But in Brussels and London, there's little or no appetite for that. Katya Adler, BBC News, Brussels.
Well, let's talk to Alex Forsyth at Westminster. So, Alex, a deadline of 2 weeks for the government to come up with what it's prepared to pay for. Is the government likely to change tack, do you think?
I think the government recognises that reaching agreement, particularly on the financial settlement, will be hard. But despite the difficulties in Brussels, it is still insisting today that Brexit will happen, even saying it will write the date into law. Now, part of the reason for that is to appease MPs who are worried it might slip. and those who didn't want it to be left up to ministers to decide the precise date. But it's also about the government trying to show some muscle, trying to get on the front foot after a difficult few weeks, and to prove its commitment to Brexit, because next week a big piece of legislation will be debated in the Commons, the bill that brings EU law into UK law ready for departure, and there will be some parliamentary fights. So Theresa May is warning MPs not to use that to try and slow or stop Brexit. Now, most don't want that. They've accepted it's happening. But even today, the man who wrote the legal process for leaving the EU has suggested it could be reversed, Downing Street firmly dismissing that.
Alex at Westminster, thank you.
So there's now an exact time and date for the UK's exit from the EU, and the Prime Minister says she won't tolerate any attempts to block it. But Lord Kerr, the former diplomat who helped draft Article 50, says the withdrawal process is not irreversible. We'll hear from him in a moment. In Brussels, where the 6th round of talks have been taking place, the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, added another ticking clock, saying the UK has just 2 weeks to offer clarifications or concessions over the key Brexit stumbling blocks. Here's our political correspondent, Michael Craig.
From a wet Brussels, the message from the EU negotiating team was blunt. It's imperative that if Britain wants European leaders next month to start talks on trade, Whitehall has just a fortnight to make its offer on the divorce bill a lot clearer. Michel Barnier gave a simple answer to this question.
Could you confirm for me that you will need clarifications or concessions, whichever you prefer, from the UK within 2 weeks in order to move on to the second phase in December? Thank you.
My answer, he said, is yes. And there's also big disagreement still about the Irish border. To prevent a hard border and preserve the Good Friday Agreement, the EU says, the single market and the customs union should be maintained in Northern Ireland. David Davis isn't having that.
We respect the European Union desire to protect the legal order of the single market and the customs union. But that cannot come at cost to the constitutional and economic integrity of the United Kingdom. As I said before, we recognise the need for specific solutions for the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland. But let me be clear. This cannot amount to creating a new border inside our United Kingdom.
It's 7 months since Theresa May triggered the Article 50 withdrawal process. But in London today, the man who drafted the Article 50 procedure for the EU said it's not legally irrevocable for Britain.
While we're in. While the divorce talks proceed, the parties are still married. Reconciliation is still possible. The article requires the parties to negotiate the arrangements for our withdrawal, but we are not required to withdraw just because Mrs May sent her letter.
And the Open Britain campaign says that if the brand new car that the Brexit campaign promised us, metaphorically of course, turns out to be an old banger, then British voters should get a second chance. Labour Brexiteer Frank Field says Lord Kerr was refreshingly honest.
Most of those who want to wreck our chances of leaving Europe successfully disguise their real motives. So he's got huge congratulations for that. He ought to encourage his other colleagues, many of them, who wish to appear in sheep's clothing, although there are walls on this issue, to adopt his open approach. It's to be very much welcomed.
As MPs start debating next week the EU withdrawal bill line by line, the government's adopted an idea put forward by Mr Field to put an exact date on Brexit, 11 p.m. on the 29th of March 2019. And Mrs May says she won't tolerate any attempt to delay or stop that.
Well, earlier I spoke to Lord Kerr, the former UK ambassador to the European Union, who helped draft Article 50, and I asked him why he's saying that Brexit is reversible.
There's nothing in the treaty, there's nothing in this Article 50 which says you can't take back your letter, a letter like Mrs May's letter, and just carry on as if nothing had happened.
And was that intentional?
Oh yes, absolutely, yeah. We had another clause that says once you've left, you can't come back in again. except by the front door.
Looking at the way this is going, do you think Europe is almost facilitating the idea of Britain changing its mind? I mean, could it be deliberate that we are not making progress?
No.
Because they see the possibility of British public opinion turning?
You're a Machiavellian figure. No, I don't think so, because people on all sides, particularly businessmen on all sides, are terrified of the idea that there is actually no agreement, that there's no deal, that it's cliff edges. That's terrible for everybody, terrible for, our contract's valid.
Well, precisely. So they might think Britain might look at this as terrible and decide not to do it.
Well, but you're much more Machiavellian than people like me. I'm just a humble negotiator or ex-negotiator. It's worst for us, they know. It's bad for everybody, but it's worse for us, the no-deal situation.
I mean, aren't you essentially saying that Europe can do whatever it wants and that what it really says in Article 50 doesn't matter? That if all the governments get together, they can decide anything?
No, it's an EU of law. It's based on the treaty. But it has a political flexibility. You're right. You're
because
very Machiavellian today.
No, but some people think, you're trying to scare us by saying, look, we can stop the clock, but if we're out, then we can't come back in very easily. And surely, if Europe is politically flexible, they could equally, 5 years down the road, say, yes, we'll let you back on the same terms you used to be in.
No, they couldn't do that. There's a queue of people wanting in, and everybody has to be seen to be going through the same rules. We would not have to wait long in the queue. We would jump the queue. We would, of course, not get any budget rebate if we were coming in from outside. We would not get the opt-outs that people like me have negotiated in the last 45 years. At present, we have a very bespoke arrangement. If we came in, having left, came back again, we'd get standard terms, no messing about.
Why are you saying this? Are you saying this because you fear we are being deceived? Or because you're a Remainer and you think we're making a terrible mistake?
Yes, I was a Remainer. I plead guilty to the charge. I am a Remainer. I'm an expert. I'm an enemy of the people. I'm all sorts of evil things. I'm saying all this because I was involved in the writing of this article. I probably know more about what it means and why it means that and how it got there than most people. And I think that the public debate in this country hasn't really grasped that there's nothing irrevocable about the letter she sent, that there are lots of options still open to us.
Lord Kerr.
There seem to be clocks ticking on Brexit wherever you look today after the announcement by the Prime Minister to reassure those concerned of a concrete date and time for our departure from the EU. A clear countdown was on, as you can see here, just over 500 days to go. But then a real sense of urgency came today as the EU's chief negotiator threw down an ultimatum: sort the divorce bill within the next fortnight or forget moving on to trade talks in December. And citizens' rights and the Northern Ireland border need to be sorted too.
For the first time in almost a month, the negotiators have been back around the table, but the pace of progress has slowed to a crawl. No announcements or decisions, we were told, and yet the clock ticks relentlessly on. More than 500 days have passed since the referendum, and yet now, with deadlines looming, the UK's been told there's just a fortnight left to do a deal on the Brexit bill.
Could you confirm for me that you will need clarifications from the UK within 2 weeks in order to move on to the second phase?
Ma réponse est oui.
My answer is yes.
And that means just 2 weeks to make sufficient progress on the Irish border, citizens' rights and on money. The UK offer of around €20 billion is still less than half what the other 27 will accept. With so much still to do, it's not clear why the pace of talks has slowed rather than accelerate, as Theresa May said it would last month. What happened to accelerating these talks, as Mrs May promised? It's been almost a month since you last met. These talks only lasted 2 days instead of the normal 4.
We remain ready and willing to engage as often and as quickly as is needed to ensure this outcome over the weeks remaining ahead of the December European Council. There's been a change in pace, I think, But ultimately, this is about delivering results, and that will depend on the content, not just the speed of the negotiation.
A former EU trade negotiator believes that if the December summit comes and goes without trade talks starting, crashing out without a deal gets ever more likely.
You've got to think of it at around 50-50 at that point, and rising with every week that progress isn't made.
And what would that mean for businesses facing that?
I mean, that's utterly catastrophic. I mean, we talk about catastrophe a lot. A bad deal isn't necessarily catastrophic. A bad deal is not as good as one a different one that we could have had. Crashing out without a deal is genuinely catastrophic.
That 2-week deadline means there's probably time for only one more round of talks. For London, it may really be make your mind up time. James Mates, News at 10, Brussels.
Well, at the end of the 6th round of the Brexit negotiations, it's worth taking stock, perhaps, of exactly where we've got to on some of those key issues. First off, on citizens' rights. The EU today welcomed useful clarifications on guaranteeing rights. But Michel Barnier is still pushing for a role for the European Court of Justice, and as we know, the UK is against that. They're also yet to agree on exporting welfare payments, allowing EU citizens to send them back to their home countries. On the Irish border, Barnier says there is still a need for what he calls technical and regulatory solutions to resolve the unique problem of what will become of Northern Ireland's border with the EU. In other words, no real clarity there. And then, of course, there is the so-called divorce bill. David Davis says substantial technical progress has been made, but Michel Barnier says the EU still needs clarification on the pledge Mrs May made in Florence that no EU member will lose out financially from Brexit. Well, let's go live now to Brussels and James, who's there for us still this evening. And James, there's little doubt the government's desperate to get onto those trade talks. Will this ultimatum finally force the PM, do you think, to reveal her hand on a so-called divorce bill?
Well, Britain's policy and wish remains that in less than 18 months they can have a fully formed free trade agreement with the rest of the EU, plus a negotiated implementation period to take us 2 years or so on and into that new arrangement. Now, there are many who think that's totally unrealistic. But if next month, at this December summit here in Brussels, they don't pull the trigger on those trade talks, then it becomes totally unthinkable that this could ever happen. Indeed, people will begin to believe that what's going to happen is we drop out of the EU without any sort of agreement in March 2019, let alone a full free trade agreement. And so that's the importance on this 2-week deadline now. Balloons have been trailed from London. There have been straws in the wind that even some on the Brexit side of this debate think that perhaps it's better now just to up this offer from the 20 billion or so that she made in Florence in September to the 50-60 billion, which is the only thing that's going to unlock this. But here, while they've been hearing this, they've been waiting for some sort of firm offer, and it simply hasn't come. And France and Germany and the others have remained absolutely unanimous and adamant that without it there will be no trade talks. So this is the moment when the British cabinet has to decide, are they going that way or not?
OK, James, thank you very much indeed for that.
Today we passed the halfway point in Brexit negotiations. In 504 days and 28 minutes we will exit the EU. And there has been a definite ramping up of the tension when it comes to Ireland's future. Yes, the EU is demanding that the UK spell out what it will pay Brussels when it leaves in 2019 in just 2 weeks' time or face more delay in the talks on future trade ties. But it is the EU's insistence on an all-Ireland approach for Ireland where there appears to be most friction tonight. And that friction also extends to relations between the government and their partners, the DUP. So is this an intractable problem that could scupper the whole negotiations? Here's Chris Cook.
The hardest question in the Brexit talks is about Northern Ireland. Money remains a major sticking point in the negotiations, but we know how we can fix that. There's no simple way out of the Irish question. Let us say Britain's no longer in a customs union with the European Union. That lets us strike trade deals with third countries which have no similar deal with the EU. But the EU needs to be able to stop goods from that third country flowing into Northern Ireland and then into the EU via the Republic. Further, what if we decide to diverge from EU rules, so goods in our markets no longer meet all EU standards? Ireland needs to be able to check stuff and maybe turn it back before it gets into their market. So they need a border. Now, everyone says they want to avoid that. A hard border would be a major economic burden, especially for farmers, and could undermine the peace process. The EU appears to be shifting position. In September, they said the onus to propose solutions which overcome the challenges created on the island of Ireland remains on the United Kingdom. The solution was up to us. There's been talk of answers involving customs technology and clever application of EU rules. We wanted a smart border that no one would notice. But a leaked document from the European Commission has shown a change in tack, saying it's essential for the UK to commit to ensuring no emergence of regulatory divergence from those rules of the internal market and the customs union in Northern Ireland. That's significant. A radical idea that's been pressed by Dublin is now seemingly the preferred plan of Brussels. This would be a big deal. Northern Ireland would, in effect, be treated as part of the EU customs union and single market to eliminate the need for a hard border. But that would require, in effect, customs arrangements for goods travelling between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, something the UK says is unacceptable.
We respect the European Union desire to protect the legal order of the single market and the customs union. But that cannot come at cost to the constitutional and economic integrity of the United Kingdom.
So could a British government reliant on DUP votes really separate Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK? If not, it needs to find a plausible plan to make that border as soft as possible. Dublin, remember, has a veto on taking talks forward and on any final trade deal.
Chris Cook, well, a short time ago I spoke to the former Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern. He was one of the architects of the Good Friday Agreement along with Tony Blair and served as the head of the Irish government for more than a decade. I began by asking him whether he thought a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and the North was now inevitable.
Well, I think the issue is fairly clear that it's impossible to have an invisible border or a border that's controlled by technology if you're not in the single market. The argument today is the EU have come to the conclusion after 12 months of looking at this that they believe to stay in the single market and to stay in the customs union is the only way you can avoid totally a border. Of course, the difficulty for that is that the British government don't agree with that and the DUP don't agree with that. The Irish government do. So it's a difficult position, and I'm afraid nobody has worked out how you can get the circle to work and cover everybody's point of view.
But do you think the government in Dublin is four square behind the other European countries' position on this?
Yes, there's no doubt about that. I think throughout the negotiations right throughout this year, the EU position is one position. The Irish government are locked into that.
You're telling me that the Republic of Ireland would vote with other EU countries for a deal that included a hard border and all the implications of that?
No, I think it's just not feasible for the Republic of Ireland to agree to the reinstallation of a hard border after 20 years. There's the ramifications of it from trade and business, from agriculture, from all of our other sectors of industry, big and small, are bad enough. But the difficulties for the ongoing peace process, and we've enough of problems with that. But for the Irish government to agree to putting back a border is not something that is likely to happen.
So in your view then, the only way to work this is to have an internal border in the UK to take in ports and airports?
Well, the one great thing about Europe is that it's always been good at finding solutions to complex issues. Sometimes people say they fudge these issues, but I think that's unfair. I think over the last 40 years, many difficult situations, they have found ways of formulating solutions. And this issue of the Irish border has been well and truly discussed.
Well, you of all people then might know what might happen on a hard border. You know, a former Taoiseach and also an architect of the Good Friday Agreement. What would be the impact on peace, a hard-won peace in Ireland with a hard border?
I think it would be a huge setback to us. You know, the idea of putting customs checks up against security checks, I don't think we're ever going to go back to the watchtowers or the huge security presence. I don't think anyone is suggesting that, and I don't think that's going to happen. But the idea of having anything, at the moment you can leave Dublin, I can leave my house in Dublin, be in Belfast in an hour, 40 minutes. You don't see a security person anywhere. And you know, traffic duty now and again, but there's no difficulties, no problems. To go back into, you know, putting the physical border back in place in any way, it will undermine, I think, so much of what successive governments have done from Tony Blair in my time. And of course, the people who will be drinking the champagne will be dissidents, because they'll see this as great for them. It will give them a target again. And it just would be so disastrous. I mean, the amount of effort that's been put in by so many people to avoid that, to consider going back to that is just unbelievable.
So you're saying that there may be
I don't think anyone wants to do it.
No, but you're saying that that might lead inevitably to a return to violence.
I don't think so. I think, you know, there 98 or 99% of the people on the island of Ireland now, on all sides, do not want to go back to violence. But I have to say, if you wanted to try and find a way of giving those who want to do it, and there is the 1%, and 1% can be very dangerous. We see it all over the world. You don't need many people to cause mayhem and to cause destruction and devastation. So you certainly, if you put a physical border back across the island of Ireland, you're certainly giving a huge incentive to those that want to cause mischief.
Is there a scenario here that is more likely to lead to the reunification of Ireland?
Well, I think that issue is now more on the agenda than it was before.
As a result of Brexit?
Yeah, from the result of Brexit. There are more people debating it. They're debating it in college debates now, I notice. I've been asked to several of them. And, you know, people are actively looking at what shape would it be, how would it happen. My own view is that there will be a time to discuss that. It's not now, because we still have the institutions not up and running. We still have too much of an unsettled climate to be having votes on it. But I think inevitably, in the Good Friday Agreement, a border poll is part of the clauses in it. And I think Brexit brings it closer, but not too close, in my view.
The irony of this, of course, is that in a way, the Republic of Ireland should understand the majority decision in the UK to take back what they see as sovereignty from the EU. Do you respect that decision?
Of course we respect that decision. I mean, the EU are entitled, or the UK were entitled to have the vote, and they've made that decision. But I think the UK have to understand, by making that decision, they made a hell of a mess for us, and that they have an obligation and responsibility to help us to find a solution. And so far in the border issue, they haven't done that.
Bertie Ahern, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.